A group of economic heavyweights, including former Treasurer Peta Credlin, former Reserve Bank Governor Bernie Fraser, they're urging the Morrison government to pursue urgent tax reform amid a mountain of pandemic-induced debt and soaring expenditure on health and aged care. It comes as a number of working-age Australians is set to drastically shrink over the coming 4 decades. This is the 4 decades we're all talking about climate change and big money there. By 2060, there'll be just 2.7 workers per retiree, which is down from 4 workers per retiree now. Let's discuss this with the panel. Let's bring them in from Melbourne, business commentator Terry McCrann, and from Sydney, Sky News business editor Ross Greenwood. Honestly, Terry, I tell you, security issues in our region, this massive welfare state we've got now and growing, COVID debt, extraordinary, biggest debt load since the post-war generations, now this climate madness. If we've got fewer taxpayers into the future, how on earth does Australia pay its way?
Well, unfortunately, Peter, there's a very obvious bottom line, and that is that the ordinary Australian taxpayer is going to be slugged more and more. Whatever way that actually happens, whether it's income tax, whether it's GST, whether it's indirect taxes, which impact ultimately on the final taxpayer, like company tax, they will, and excise, obviously, they will be paying more. Any prospect of tax reform, serious tax reform, real tax reform, was looking very dubious before we got into the COVID mess, before we blew the budget right over the cliff, before we headed for that $1 trillion of debt and budget deficits basically for the rest of our lives. I don't see the budget ever getting back to surplus, even though we will continue to see the governments taking more and more tax revenues from the effects of bracket creep, which will still happen even if inflation remains low, and that's looking extremely dubious as well. So the bottom line is, it's a good idea to talk about tax reform. It's obviously urgent. It's obviously fundamental, one of those things that is fundamental to building a successful future, but unfortunately, we're not going to see it.
Yeah, it all comes, Ross, just after we've had a Delta downgrade from the IMF. They say Australia's economy has been hit hardest of any economies in the world by the Delta strain. What's the significance of that? The Treasurer's forecasting lower GDP as well. We've got Christmas coming up, we're getting out of lockdowns, but we've got a long way to go.
Well, there's no doubt. No, look, Terry and I discussed this a few weeks ago. It doesn't matter whether you say that we are technically in recession after the December quarter or whether we are already in recession as a result of the lockdowns. The fact is that the economic hurt that's been imposed upon the Australian economy and the Australian people and business sector has been immense as a result of these lockdowns. And so this is adding to the debt that ultimately your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren will continue to inherit, which either significantly affects their standard of living or indeed means that there's got to be dramatic change. Now, normally, if you get change, say, to a tax system, it happens in the middle of a deep recession, because that's when, if you like, the people are generally more acceptable of significant change. But the question is, you've got to have politicians who are brave enough to take the political hit as a result of it. And I said the really interesting part about this long term is, workers ultimately here are slugged higher taxes than what they are in other parts of the world. Companies are slugged higher taxes than what they are in other parts of the world. And sure, it's a great place to live, it's a wonderful lifestyle and all that sort of stuff, but people certainly do pay for it.
Yeah, they haven't even started on net zero. You wait till that comes, goodness
exactly.
me. Let's talk nuclear power. I foreshadowed this a little bit earlier, but French President Emmanuel Macron has announced a huge new investment in small-scale nuclear reactors. That's what we're talking about. That should be here in Australia. This is part of his new 2030 roadmap. As it comes as just new announcements recently, the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida said he'll be restarting the nuclear plants that were mothballed after Fukushima and boosting their electricity supply and reducing emissions. Terry, we know that France gets around 70% of its power from nuclear, and the French households and businesses, as a result, pay significantly less for their power than other EU countries and Britain. When on earth are we going to start having a sensible debate about nuclear here? And surely, if Morrison wants to go to Glasgow with a 2050 target that's plausible, he's got to have nuclear on the table.
Well, exactly, Peter. It's great news for the French, and it might even be great news for our uranium producers. Just like we produce coal into the future, which most of us will be happy to export to those that still want to use coal-fired power and keep their lights on, I presume we'll be very happy to sell our uranium and ship it off to France to keep French lights on. But what about Australian lights? What about Australian heating? What about Australian industry? As you say, Peter, if we're going to abandon fossil fuels, there has to be a commitment to nuclear energy. There has to be an accelerated program to build these modular nuclear power plants in Australia. And this is exactly, I mean, I don't think Scott Morrison should go to Glasgow. I think it's insane. And I think he was particularly invited not to come when the privileged Pratt, who I won't name, came out this week to say he should come to Glasgow. But if he is going to go to Glasgow, and if he wants to actually hold out something which makes sense, this has to be around nuclear power, as you say.
Okay. I guess my frustration, Ross, this debate is so often about should we do something about emissions. That's just a diversion, right? That's a culture war diversion. The issue is not should we do something about emissions, but how we do it.
Well, that's right, because
do it. And I just can't, there's a smart way and a dumb way.
But Peter, you know, if we're going to a net zero target, then we're doing it with one hand tied behind our back. The fact is right now, you've got energy coal prices, steaming coal prices at all-time record highs because China's got a shortage. The lights are turning off there. So all of a sudden they've relinquished their bans on Australian coal to try and get the energy to turn the lights back on. So in the meantime, we're going to stop that. And we're going to suddenly say, well, we don't have anything else except the sun and the wind. And we hope we've got enough of that and batteries. Now, sure, the technology is changing. You need everything. But one of the things you also need in the mix is nuclear because A, of the emissions, B, because of the reliability of the energy source. That's the key. Otherwise, you're trying to play this game against other nations with one hand tied behind your back.
And just a quick one before we go, gentlemen, I had a good look at the BCA report, all the 90-odd pages. Terry McCrann, have you ever seen reliable economic modelling, and we don't see the working papers here, we just get the summary charts, but have you ever seen a reliable economic modelling that goes 50 years out?
It's insane. I mean, it's ridiculous. We're talking about forecast before. I mean, one thing you know about a short-term forecast, whether it's the weather forecast or a budget fiscal forecast, is that the one number it won't be is the one that's precisely predicted. It'll be something else. And 50 years out, you may as well be playing with tarot cards.
Hey, Ross, they update the budget twice a year. They do the original budget, they do my EFO, they can't ever get that right. Who can model 50 years out?
Oh, that's exactly right. That's so true. You know, you think about the things that have happened in the last 18 months to the world and to Australia, and now say to yourself, we're going to now reliably tell you what's going to happen in 50 years' time. As I say, it's just one of these things when they can't get my EFO and the budget forecast right every 6 months, and the Reserve Bank hasn't got an inflation forecast right for 5 years, well, what hope you got in 50 years' time?
Yeah, they think we're idiots. Gentlemen, see you next week.